Have you ever just stopped and wondered why everything seems to be getting so expensive lately?
Yeah, or why politics feels so charged,
Yeah.
so intense, almost daily.
Exactly. And the world overall, it just feels a bit more chaotic than it used to, doesn't it?
Definitely.
Well, today we're going to dive deep into the thinking of someone who might have some surprising, maybe even unsettling answers. We're talking about the legendary investor Ray Dalio.
Ah, yes. The founder of Bridgewater Associates, one of the biggest hedge funds out there.
That's the one. And he's put forward some pretty bold predictions recently.
Bold is one word for it. Shocking might be another.
Right. He's talking about a major economic crisis being on the horizon.
And not just that. He puts the chance of a U.S. Civil War, believe it or not, at around 40% in the next 5 to 10 years.
40%. That's startling. And then there's the global picture.
Also a 40% chance, he estimates, of World War III within the next decade.
Okay, so those are some heavy predictions. Our mission today is really to unpack all of this. Why does Dalio think these things? And importantly, what could it all mean for you, for us, as things keep shifting globally?
Sounds like a vital conversation to have.
Definitely. Let's start with the core of his thinking. He has this concept he calls the big cycle. What exactly is that?
Right, the big cycle. It's essentially Dalio's model for looking at history. It's how he understands the rise and fall of empires, nations, economies, the whole sweep.
Okay, a grand framework. How does it work?
He breaks it down into 6 stages. It's
Mhm.
quite fascinating, actually. Stage 1 is the good part, a booming economy. High growth, lots of jobs, wealth increasing. Things feel optimistic.
Sounds familiar at times.
It does. But Dalio warns this often leads straight into stage 2, the bubble. This is where asset prices, like stocks or real estate, start shooting up maybe too fast. Speculation increases and the financial system gets riskier.
Okay, I think people remember bubbles. Then what?
Well, then comes stage 3, the financial crisis. The bubble pops. Asset prices fall sharply. Banks and other financial institutions get into trouble.
Right, like 2008 maybe.
That's a classic
Yeah.
example, yeah. And that naturally leads into stage 4, recession or depression. Economic growth goes negative, unemployment shoots up, and governments usually step in trying to stimulate things.
Okay, so far it feels like a standard economic cycle, maybe, but there are more stages.
Yes, and this is where it gets particularly relevant to his current warnings. Stage 5 is internal conflict.
Internal conflict, what does that involve?
This is characterized by things like really wide gaps in wealth, growing economic inequality. You see widespread social dissatisfaction, and politics becomes extremely polarized. Sound familiar?
Yeah, unfortunately it does. And the final stage.
Stage 6 can be revolution and war. This could mean violent conflict, sudden drastic changes in how a country is governed or its economy works. It could be civil war, or it could spill over into international war.
Wow. Okay, so where does Dalio think, say, the United States is right now in this cycle?
And this is the crucial part of his current assessment. He believes the U.S. is firmly in stage 5, deep into that internal conflict stage.
Stage 5, facing severe internal conflict.
Exactly. And he sees it as a point where some kind of major change becomes much more likely, a real inflection point.
So if we're supposedly in stage 5, what signs does he actually point to? What specific indicators in the U.S. make him say that?
Well, he talks a lot about the data on income inequality, how the gap between the rich and poor has widened significantly, and how that naturally creates, unhappiness and frustration among large parts of the population.
Okay, the wealth gap. What else?
Then there's the rise of populism, and he's careful to note this is happening on both the left and the right.
How does he define populism in this context?
He sees it as leaders who claim they represent the common people against some kind of selfish elite. And a key characteristic, he stresses, is that these leaders, these movements, are often unwilling to compromise.
Unlike maybe more traditional, centrist politicians who might seek middle ground?
Precisely. Dalio argues this lack of compromise, this intense polarization and internal fighting, it doesn't just cause problems at home, it also weakens the country's standing internationally. Other powers see the division.
Interesting point. So are there specific things he says we should be watching? Key metrics for the U.S.?
Yeah, he boils it down to 3 crucial things to keep an eye on. First, is the country earning more than it's spending? Or is it just piling on more debt? That's fundamental.
Okay, the national balance sheet, basically.
Right. Second, how are people interacting internally? Is there mostly cooperation, or is conflict becoming the norm, the social fabric question?
The degree of unity, or lack thereof.
Exactly. And third, What about external competitors? Are new powers, specifically he mentions China and Russia, continuing to grow stronger relative to the U.S.?
So it's this mix of economic health, internal cohesion, and the external power balance.
That's his trifecta, yeah. He sees all three flashing warning signs for the U.S. right now.
It really does sound like it goes way beyond just, fluctuations in the stock market. So let's talk about the economy then. What does this big cycle perspective mean for, well, our wallets, for the everyday economy we experience?
Right. It connects directly. Dalio explains that when governments create excessive debt and, crucially, print large amounts of money to cover it.
Which has happened quite a bit recently.
Indeed. It inevitably leads to the devaluation of the currency, in this case the US dollar. And that means inflation, the thing you asked about right at the start.
Everything getting more expensive.
Exactly. Inflation means your money buys less. It also means that holding cash, or even traditional bonds, gives you poor, often negative, real returns. Your savings are effectively shrinking.
So people don't want to hold cash?
Naturally, they try to get out of it, maybe buy assets they think will hold value better. This dynamic then forces banks and governments to offer higher interest rates to try and make holding cash or bonds attractive again.
But that makes borrowing more expensive, right? For mortgages, for businesses.
Yeah, precisely. So you end up in this potentially nasty situation where borrowing costs are high, but inflation might still be high. That's when you risk getting stagflation.
Stagflation, I remember hearing about that in the 70s. Stagnant economy plus inflation.
That's the unpleasant mix, yes. Slow or no economic growth, but prices are still rising fast. And Dalio is famously direct on this point. He's the one who said cash is trash during inflationary periods.
Because its value just melts away.
It just gets eroded continuously. And he's not just talking about losing purchasing power day to day. He means it fundamentally changes how people invest, how businesses operate, how governments have to set policy. It forces a huge reevaluation of what's safe.
Okay, so the economic picture is challenging.
Yeah.
But you mentioned Dalio sees something else happening within countries, especially the U.S., that makes these economic problems even more dangerous. It's not purely about the money.
No, absolutely not. This is where the social and political dimension becomes critical in his view. He issues a pretty stark warning. If people start valuing their own beliefs, their ideology, or their political tribe more than they value the overall system, the country itself, then that system is in real danger.
Prioritizing faction over function, essentially.
You could put it that way, yeah. And he says this is where we see the extreme political polarization really taking hold, the rise of those populist figures we talked about, left and right, who often thrive on that division and avoid compromise.
Making it harder to solve those big economic problems we just discussed.
Exactly. It creates gridlock, or worse. Dalio's deep concern is that if these struggles between extreme factions escalate, they can lead to serious social disorder. And in the most extreme scenarios, he doesn't shy away from saying it could even lead to civil war.
Which would obviously be catastrophic for the U.S., for its governance, its stability, everything.
An existential threat, as he sees it.
Wow. It's quite a chain of logic he lays out. It makes you wonder, have we actually seen this kind of pattern play out before in history? Are there parallels to what he's describing?
Oh, absolutely. Dalio is a big student of history, and he draws heavily on historical examples to support his cycle theory.
Like what, for instance?
Well, he points directly to the 1930s, the Great Depression era. He notes how several democracies during that time, think about Germany, the Weimar Republic collapsing into the Nazi regime under Hitler,
Right.
or Italy under Mussolini, Spain falling into civil war, and then Franco's rule, Japan moving towards aggressive militarism. All of them transitioned to authoritarian regimes.
And what was the common factor there in his view?
Widespread public anger and dissatisfaction. It stemmed from the severe economic hardship, deep poverty, unemployment, instability. People lost faith in the existing democratic systems to solve their problems.
So economic crisis fueled political upheaval.
Yes. And he cites other major revolutions, too. The French Revolution back in the late 1700s, the Russian Revolution in 1917, the Chinese Revolution in 1949, Cuba in the 1950s. They all fit parts of this pattern.
Is there a pattern within those revolutions that he highlights?
Yes, and it's a particularly chilling one. He observes that in many of these historical conflicts, There were initially moderate groups, people trying to find some kind of compromise or middle path.
Okay, trying to hold things together.
But as the conflict intensified, as things got more extreme, these moderates were often pushed aside or, worse, eliminated.
Eliminated.
He gives the example of the Reign of Terror during the French Revolution. You had radical leaders like Robespierre using the guillotine, executing thousands. And many of those executed weren't just the old aristocracy, they were moderates who were seen as not radical enough, leaving only the most extreme factions battling for power.
Good grief. It's dark.
It is, and Dalio connects that historical pattern to what he observes today. He sees a similar trend, maybe less violent, but directionally similar, where centrist politicians seem to be losing ground or stepping back.
And the political arena becomes dominated by the extremes.
It feels like the competition shifts towards who can be the most uncompromising, who can appeal most strongly to their base rather than finding common ground. He even mentioned, I don't recall the exact figures, but some striking poll data suggesting something like 10 or 15% of people in one U.S. political party actually wish death upon members of the opposing party.
Seriously. Wish death.
Yeah, and also wouldn't want their children marrying someone from the other party. It shows the depth of the animosity.
That goes way beyond simple political disagreement.
It really does.
Yeah.
He also notes that we're seeing internal migration patterns in the U.S. driven not just by, say, taxes or jobs, but increasingly by people wanting to live around others who share their political values. A sorting based on ideology.
Creating even stronger echo chambers.
Potentially, yes. So wrapping up this historical point, Dalio's core warning here is that when you combine a major economic crisis with this kind of severe internal political conflict, democracies become very fragile.
And the risk of fundamental change, even regime change, becomes real. Especially, he thinks, for the U.S. right now.
That's his assessment, yes.
Okay, so we've talked about the internal dynamics, the economy, the social divisions. But if we connect this back to that bigger global picture, Dalio mentioned another powerful force driving this cycle. What was that?
Right, the external dimension. He stresses that the rise of new global powers is a critical piece of the puzzle. Specifically, he points to China and increasingly Russia.
How does their rise fit into this cycle?
Well, the theory goes that as an existing dominant power, like the U.S. currently starts to show signs of weakness, maybe financially or through internal division.
Like the stage 5 issues we discussed.
Exactly. Then rising competitors are naturally positioned to challenge that dominance. They grow stronger militarily, economically, in trade influence. They sense an opportunity.
A power vacuum starting to form, maybe?
Or at least a shift in the balance. It's interesting, in his book, The Changing World Order, which came out a few years ago, he initially estimated the chance of a U.S. civil war at about 30% within 5-10 years.
Okay, 30%. Still high, but...
But he also put the chance of a major conflict between the U.S. and China at around 35% within 10 years.
And you said earlier he's updated those numbers.
Yes. More recently, he's indicated he thinks those probabilities have crept up slightly. He now puts both scenarios, U.S. civil war and major U.S.-China conflict, somewhere in the 35 to 40% range.
So slightly higher risk for both internal and external conflict.
Correct. He notes that events are unfolding rapidly, maybe even faster than he initially anticipated, and he specifically points to the war in Ukraine as something that's accelerating these international shifts.
How so? The Ukraine conflict.
He sees it solidifying alliances and hardening divisions, comparing the current global alignment to periods before past world wars where you essentially have two main opposing sides forming, along with some neutral countries caught in between.
That's a sobering comparison. So let's zoom in on Ukraine then. You said Dalio sees it as a critical turning point. What specifically is he watching there? How does that situation feed into his bigger cycle thesis?
He pays close attention to the relationship between Russia and China. He sees them increasingly aligned with a shared interest in challenging U.S. global dominance.
Okay, it's strategic partnership.
Yes.
Okay.
And from China's perspective, he argues they view U.S. policies aimed at containing China as direct attempts to limit Beijing's rightful sphere of influence in its own region.
Containing China.
Well,
Like limiting its military or economic reach.
exactly. And Dalio draws a really interesting, maybe provocative historical parallel here. He compares China's feeling of being contained today to how the U.S. felt during the Cuban Missile Crisis back in 1962.
The Cuban Missile Crisis. How does that compare?
Well, back then, the U.S. fiercely asserted its dominance in Latin America, its backyard, bringing the world to the brink of nuclear war to prevent Soviet missiles in Cuba. Dalio suggests China feels the U.S. is similarly trying to hem it in, in Asia, its sphere of influence. It highlights the danger when great powers feel their core interests are threatened.
That's a powerful analogy. So within the current Ukraine conflict, what are the key things Dalio says we should monitor?
He outlines three main issues. First, simply the conflict outcome. How does it actually end? For instance, if Russia achieves its main goals, maybe Ukraine becomes neutral, Russia keeps control of eastern territories, Putin stays in power, and crucially, the Russian economy isn't totally destroyed by sanctions.
You mean if the GDP drop is manageable, like maybe 10–12% instead of a total collapse?
Right. If Russia weathers the storm economically, that sends a message about the limits of Western pressure. So outcome is number one.
Okay, what's second?
Second is the effectiveness of sanctions. This is huge. The world is watching closely to see just how powerful U.S. financial sanctions really are. Dalio actually considers this economic leverage, especially control over the dollar system, to be the U.S.'s greatest remaining power. Maybe more so than its military, which isn't as uniquely dominant as it once was.
So sanctions are a key weapon, and Ukraine is a test case for their power.
A major test case, yes. And third, he's watching the formation of alliances. Which countries are siding with the U.S. and its allies? Which are aligning more with Russia and China or trying to stay neutral? He sees the world clearly dividing, much like it did before World War I and II, into those Axis and Allied type blocks.
This division into blocks and the sanctions. Does he see long-term consequences there?
Definitely. He talks about the potential long-term impact of the U.S. weaponizing the dollar so heavily through sanctions. While powerful now, it might push other countries, even allies, to gradually reduce their dependence on the U.S. dollar over time.
To diversify away from the dollar.
Exactly. Which could eventually erode the dollar's status as the world's primary reserve currency. That would have massive implications for the U.S. economy and its global power.
Wow. And you mentioned he draws another historical parallel here, related to sanctions.
Yes, and it's another really stark one. He compares the current situation, particularly the intense economic pressure on adversaries, to the situation Japan faced before World War II.
Japan before Pearl Harbor.
Precisely. Japan was hit with severe economic sanctions by the U.S. and others, including an oil embargo, which they perceived as an existential threat. Dalio suggests this pressure contributed significantly to their decision to launch the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941.
Can you remind us of the scale of that attack?
It was devastating. Japan sent over 350 aircraft from 6 carriers. They attacked the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii without any declaration of war. They sank or damaged 18 U.S. warships, including 8 battleships, destroyed hundreds of aircraft, and tragically killed over 2,400 American military personnel, injuring over 1,000 more.
And that, of course, brought the U.S. directly into World War II.
Immediately. Dalio uses this parallel not to predict an identical event, but to illustrate how extreme economic warfare can escalate, sometimes unpredictably, into major military conflict. It underscores the high stakes of the current geopolitical tensions.
So putting it all together, we've gone through Dalio's big cycle, the economic pressures, the internal divisions in places like the U.S., the rise of competing powers like China and Russia, and how conflicts like Ukraine might be accelerating all of this. It's a lot to take in.
It really is. His analysis weaves together finance, politics, social trends, and history into this overarching narrative about major global change. It paints a picture of interconnected forces pushing the world towards a potential turning point.
It's certainly a sobering analysis, but also a really important perspective to understand, isn't it?
I think so. This deep dive really highlights Dalio's view on just how interconnected everything is: global finance, the stability within our own countries, and the relationships between nations, and why these particular moments in the cycle, as he sees them, matter so much to all of us.
Absolutely. It leaves us with a lot to think about. So for everyone listening, what's the one thing that really stands out to you from Ray Dalio's analysis? And maybe how might thinking about these historical patterns he highlights shape the decisions we all make, big or small, moving forward?